Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. Apologies for the delay. We were trying to give some time for people to reach. It's really horrible, more than usual. Thank you for coming. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to literally the coolest event of the Climate Week. Since we are going to talk about 1.5, I had to make that joke at the beginning, I guess. We Climate Analytics are very happy to welcome you to the first of our two events for today. It has become a tradition of ours to hold events in conjunction with the Climate Week. I see many familiar faces in the audience, but maybe for those of you who don't know Climate Analytics, we are a non-profit climate science and policy institute established in 2008. We have offices in different regions. Our headquarters is based in Berlin, but we have also offices here in New York, in Perth, Australia, and associates in basically all over the world. And today we have our associates from the Caribbean and from Nepal in the room, so please make the most of them. Before I get into the content of this morning's event, just a quick reminder that the second event that's going to start promptly at 1 p.m. is also going to be held here in the same venue. And the title is What's the Hurry? Bending the Carbon Emissions Curve. So if you are available, you are obviously welcome to stay the full day with us. Okay, so this morning we will split our time in two parts. First, you will hear a few presentations that will set the scene, and this will be followed by a panel discussion, which will provide you space for your burning questions. So please start thinking about questions as you are watching the presentation. So this morning we are focusing on a very timely and relevant subject, staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. You will hear first from Dr. Michael Oppenheimer on the importance of the IPCC special report on 1.5 that will be finalized next week in Korea and released to the public later in October. Following this, Dr. Tabea Lissner will speak to the impacts we are already seeing and what can still be avoided by keeping to the 1.5 limit. She will also give us a preview of the very latest research on the evolution of tropical cyclone seasons, I've heard. So very excited about that. So that was for the why part. So now the how part. We will hear from Dr. Hare and Jasmin Cantzler on the steps that need to be taken to stay below 1.5 and the current trends and scenarios in coal, gas, and renewable energy. And finally, we are very lucky to have with us today for our panel discussion Ms. Helen Montfort from the World Resource Institute and Ms. Justine Liebel from the Climate Bonds Initiative. All will be very ably moderated by Mr. Richard Black. Richard is the director of the UK think tank, the Climate and Energy Intelligence Unit. He has covered numerous UN summits, including UNFCCC meetings, Rio Plus 20, as BBC Environment correspondent, and Richard was also the Director of Communications for the Global Ocean Commission. So thank you again for being with us today. And now, Richard, over to you.
Thanks very much, Letitia, and thanks very much, Climate Analytics, for inviting me here. As Letitia said, my background's in journalism. I was with the BBC for years and covered the launch of several IPCC reports. And just thinking about this one, I think there's a case for saying that this is the most important IPCC report ever. Because we have something very specific, the Paris Agreement. And I think what this does is, as Letitia was saying, to give us the hows and the whys of 1.5. What's the point of doing 1.5 rather than 2? And the hows, what's the actual transformation needed? What's the speed of decarbonisation needed to get there? So I'm really looking forward to this morning. It's the first time I've had the chance to get a really detailed look at it from some of the people that know it best. Of course, the Paris Agreement is the last in a long line of agreements going back to Rio and Article 2 of the Convention and the promise to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Arguably, that's what we're talking about in the Paris Agreement. And I think it's wonderful, therefore, that our first speaker is Michael Oppenheimer, who, I mean, his CV is as long as I could spend probably half an hour reading out Michael's CV, so I'm not going to do that. But I think one of the important things is that Michael was there at the beginning, before Rio, trying to work out how you describe what stopping climate change means. What does it mean to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system? And so that's a lovely long perspective now to bring us up to date with the forthcoming IPCC 1.5 special report. Michael.
Thank you, Richard. To open, I just want to first of all apologize. Usually the weather this time of year here is lovely, and this is terrible, awful. Secondly, I appreciate being invited. I'm a big fan of the work that Climate Analytics does, so it's always fun to be able to see everybody and to hear what they have to say. I'm going to give a very you put it on the other template. I'm going to give a very brief tour of the 1.5 degree report. I am not an author of the 1.5 degree report. I've read the drafts as a reviewer. I don't intend to tell you anything that's in the drafts because I'm on the next special report and they will, fry me in hell if I do. So, however, I'm going to talk to you about what the literature says that the 1.5 degree report assesses, and in that way I think you can get a feel for what it's probably going to be about. So let's see the next slide. Yes, let's see the next slide. Sure.
Self-serve.
Okay, that's me. All right. So there's the language. The first thing that's unusual about this is that the governments in the Paris Agreement actually asked IPCC to do something. This is not the first time, but this is certainly the first time that they asked the IPCC to do something this specific and at this level of salience. So that raises the stakes and the attention by governments on what the product's going to be. And what they asked them to do, essentially, I won't reread the language, is put meat on the bones of Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has the injunction that the governments need to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So what is dangerous? And looking at 1.5 degrees means essentially trying to decide what the impacts are, how serious they are. The judgment of whether they're worth avoiding is up to governments, but if the governments so decide, could you avoid those impacts? The key issues which I think you will see elucidated by the report are, number one, what's different about 1.5 degrees? Are the impacts less, say, than 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees? And particularly, are they notably less? Is it discernibly less? It's one way to put it for you old IPCC fans. And if you looked at the impacts at 1.5 degrees versus the impacts of 2 degrees or 3 degrees, would you see a break point? Would you see something which would tell governments that that is a target that they ought to aim for? Remember, the background here is the language in the Paris Agreement, which essentially favors the 2 degree target, but asks that the governments seriously consider trying to make 1.5 degrees. So that leads, if there is a discernible difference, and I'll tell you, with regard to some impacts, there is a notable difference. And I personally was a little surprised looking at the literature that came out between when the report was asked for and now when the report's going to be produced. You can make a very strong case that 1.5 degrees is a much better place to land than 2 degrees, and you can make that case not kind of generally because it's intuitive, but very specifically. Number two, very important, is it achievable? Would any government in its right mind try actually to meet this target? And that, I think, is going to remain an open question even after the report comes out. And then to help answer that question, what are the pathways? And it's not just a matter of the technological pathways or the economic pathways, it's an issue of governance. It's an issue of social structure and social transformation. It's such a large goal. How would you actually get there? It's not a matter of plug in something and all of a sudden we're at 1.5 degrees. It's not even a matter of it's expensive, but we want to plug it in. It's a matter of how do we reorganize things to plug it in after you plug it in, and that's a very difficult question, and that's what transformation is going to be all about, and that's going to be a big message I would expect in the report. So what's different about this? First, I'm going to look at this from the IPCC point of view, and I mean what's different from in a political lens. First, this is the first attempt to really, in a very specific way, breathe life into Article 2. The language is somewhere between vague and loose, and the language of Article 2 doesn't provide a lot of guidance about what temperature or CO2 concentration to land at. But in asking IPCC to do this, the governments have put IPCC very close to the line of being what's called policy prescriptive. This is something IPCC is not supposed to do. There is never a word in the IPCC report, or there isn't supposed to be, which X. You can make it look that way by putting up a bunch of evidence that only a fool would ignore. Some governments are foolish these days, I can say from personal experience. But this really puts IPCC in a little bit of peril because I think there will be statements in there which will be easily interpreted by governments as telling them what to do, and that's a no-no. And I don't know what the implications of that will be down the line, but they can't be good. Second of all, this will bring to the fore for the governments a bunch of tensions around Article 2, developing countries, non-Annex 1 countries versus Annex 1 countries, the whole issue of loss and damage, who's going to pay for countries to adapt, who's going to pay if countries can't adapt, and there's a lot of damage done by climate change, which is still a responsibility mostly historically of a handful of large emitters. It kind of puts all that at IPCC's doorstep because it makes this debate, it breathes life into this debate, and it should be, as far as what I understand, Bill can maybe tell us more later, that part of the reason that the 1.5 degree target got into the Paris Agreement to begin with was a payoff for the governments getting rid of some of the language on loss and damage. It's probably more complicated than that, but that whole debate is not a happy place for the negotiations to be at, both with regard to lowering the target and with regard to loss and damage. And we'll see whether this report pushes it one way or the other and kind of makes for a better discussion by providing a lot of interesting evidence, or really gets certain governments inflamed. We'll see. Then this is the first IPCC reports that is coming up for approval since the Trump administration took office. That's a real wild card. So far, the Trump administration has been rather quiet at the IPCC proceedings. The people who were there are essentially the same, or in approach, not much different than the ones that were there under Obama. But one of these days, the Trump administration is going to, dig down deeper and get rid of some of the people who are on the delegation now and replace them with others who might have a different view, who might have a different approach. And I can tell you, as one who's been there, that it can be very unpleasant when there are governments who are nasty, ham-handed, and don't care if IPCC is ripped apart or not. This will be very interesting. Everybody's going to be paying attention to it. And again, that folds into the question of whether there's a risk to IPCC here, not due to something IPCC will say in the report, but because of the attitudes of the US and certain other governments. And then based on personal experience, you should be aware that things can disappear from reports. We all know this. In fact, whole reports can be rejected. That's a possible outcome. If not, whole chapters can be rejected. That's a possible outcome. If not, the summary for policymakers could be made into a complete hash. That, in fact, is probably, I'd say, is a 50-50 outcome. And I had an experience where a box related to this very same issue, Article 2, a lot of people did a lot of work in it to get it to the synthesis report last time. We thought we had the approval of the then IPCC chair, and at the last minute, due to an interesting political maneuver, it wound up on the cutting room floor. There's a lot in this report that could wind up in the same place. Whoops. Okay, so, So I would anticipate an answer to these questions. Number one, many impacts at 1.5 degrees are distinguishable from 2 degrees, but there's an interesting one that may be more or less the same. That is, both of them may barely avoid a destabilization of the parts of the Antarctic ice sheet. And therefore, it may have, the difference between 1.5 and 2 may not be that much in terms of the big changes in sea level rise that will happen at larger temperatures. We don't know. This is an area of active research right now. Nevertheless, 1.5 degrees is not very pleasant either, particularly for poorer countries. And attainment, this message is sure to be there, I think, which is attainment is very, very difficult. My own personal view is we're not going to make it. Doesn't mean the world comes to an end, but I would be surprised if without a return from higher levels if we make 1.5 degrees. So to conclude, let me just say that there are 3 possible outcomes, broadly speaking. One is this works. It's a strong message, well defended. The governments don't screw it up at the meeting, and they walk away with renewed vigor, with evidence that they ought to try hard, they ought to have high ambition, even if they can't reach 1.5 degrees. And I think that that's the value of a target like this. Even if it turns out to be not easily attainable, it ups the interest of governments in doing the best they can. Number 2, it could enhance and inflame the antagonisms within the UNFCCC and bring those antagonisms into IPCC. What we've seen at IPCC plenaries is an unfortunate turn recently where the issues that are active in the UNFCCC are tested out first, and the language is shaved off in IPCC meetings which precede the UNFCCC plenaries in order to resolve issues that really ought to be left to the UNFCCC. That's a bad trend. It dilutes the scientific independence of IPCC. This report could actually inflame those tensions. And third, it could just wind up in the rubbish bin and everybody goes on about their business, which I think is also a fairly likely outcome. So that's it. Thank you for listening and enjoy the meeting.
Thanks very much, Michael. And the good news is we get not 1 but 2 chances to ask questions of Michael later in the morning. So on the issue of 1.5 versus 2, I mean, Climate Analytics has, I think, been one of the sort of leading organisations that's been commissioning and enacting research into that by people none more so than our next speaker, Dr. Tabea Lissner. She herself is an author on several of the papers that have looked at the differences between 1.5. She's been working on climate change impacts on various sectors of society for over 10 years, so I'm looking forward certainly to hearing what she's got to tell us about the difference in impacts between 1.5 and 2 that will be coming forward in the report. Tabea.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And thanks a lot, Michael, for perfectly setting the scene for the talk that I'm going to give. There's quite a few points that I'm going to pick up on. I'd like to highlight just a few things that have come forward in the recent, in the last year, essentially really highlighting the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. But I'd also like to dive into some of the recent events over 2018, really highlighting what we're already facing, so that even 1.5 is no picnic, because currently we're not necessarily picnicking either. So this is a quick kind of recap of what we're actually talking about. So both 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming are always measured, or we're talking about a warming relative to pre-industrial levels. So that actually means around the 1960s of warming. And if we look at this graph, just shows essentially the temperature increase from this pre-industrial level to nowadays, and if we compare the temperatures from there, from then to there, we're at around 1 degree of warming currently. So we're unfortunately well underway towards quite a level of warming. When we're looking at observed impacts nowadays, we're usually comparing that more or less to more recent warming, so really at a level around the 1980s. So what we're looking at then, when we're looking at impacts and attributing impacts, we're essentially talking about a warming more around 0.5 degrees of what we can actually distinguish now. So really that underlines, I think, quite well that this 0.5 degree difference also between 1.5 and 2 degrees does make quite a difference, and really a difference. And for a lot of sectors, we can really see substantial differences in impacts occurring there. Looking at this current 1 degree warming, as I mentioned, 2018 has really been a year of extremes. For example, in Europe, where we've really seen quite a serious heat wave associated with droughts all over Central and Eastern Europe. This picture shows the not River Rhine, it's the bed of River Rhine in August, where it completely fell dry. This is just one of the impacts that's we really faced over the summer. There were quite substantial losses in agricultural production, but also impacts on critical infrastructure like homes for the elderly and hospitals. And that summer really showed that also in Europe we're really facing an adaptation gap essentially when it comes to these temperatures. So we're really not really well prepared to face these kinds of extremes. And a lot of times it has been said that this summer has been quite extreme, but the question is really, is it under the current climate conditions, is it really extreme, and what does it actually mean when we talk about 1.5 and 2 degrees? 2018 is still ongoing, but a similar event actually happened in 2003, and this is really well studied because the impacts were so severe, where all over Europe actually tens of thousands of deaths were attributed to that heat wave. And if we look at the probabilities of a heat wave like that happening, kind of natural climate, so without anthropogenic warming, such an event would have been a 1 in 100 years event, so rather unlikely to happen. But even under current conditions, we see that the probability has increased for a summer like this to happen to a 1 in 4 year event. So it's really not necessarily that much of an extreme anymore. And if we then look at the likelihood of a summer like that occurring under 1.5 or 2 degree warming, we see a further increase where it's likely that for 4 out of 10 summers, we're likely to face these extreme temperatures, or for 6 out of 10 summers, respectively. So under a 2 degree warming, such extremes would become quite frequent within Europe. And just a quick glimpse to other regions of the world. Warming is expected to be even much more severe for the tropics, where heat waves of about 2 months duration every year would have to be expected under 1.5 degrees of warming, and that would increase further to around 3 months in duration every year for that region, which really is a substantial threat to the region. Plenty of other things have happened as well, with quite a lot of fatalities, floods all over the world, and also wildfires have been quite widespread all over the world, for example, also here in the States. And increasingly, science is able to actually look at these events and also attribute certain aspects, the intensity of events, to the anthropogenic climate change quite quickly. One example is the Pan-Caribbean drought that didn't happen in 2018, but is a rather recent event. And a recent study shows that at least 15% amplification really can be attributed to climate change in that case. So that science is really coming forward that can really distinguish that anthropogenic signal. Also the region here, or close to here, has actually seen a very recent extreme tropical cyclone. Florence has just, or is still having impacts on the Carolinas here, with quite a few deaths attributed to the event, and economic impacts rising as well. And an interesting question here again, has this tropical cyclone actually become more severe due to climate change? I think we've all heard the statements that it's quite likely that tropical cyclones are expected to increase in intensity due to climate change. And it's not just the wind speeds that we're looking at here, but an important aspect is also that in combination with sea level rise, floods are expected to become more severe, but also these cyclones are expected to become bigger and also carry a lot more moisture, which really is one of the most important impacts of these cyclones, where they bring a lot more precipitation. And this is something that we've seen also, or are still seeing with Florence as well, where a recent attribution study was actually able to show that this anthropogenic warming that we're already seeing up to now has actually very likely contributed to a larger size of the cyclone and increased the precipitation over the Carolinas by around 50%. And yeah, there's still regions who are facing the flooding that's coming down the rivers just now. Looking at some of the projections in terms of tropical cyclones for 1.5 and 2 degrees, this is, well, I need to go into a little bit of detail of that. It's a very important indicator for the likely intensity of wind speeds of tropical cyclones is our sea surface temperatures. And these probability functions don't actually show the frequency at all of tropical cyclones, but they just show the likelihood of an intensity storm developing as a function of the monthly sea surface temperatures. So we see here that these Category 5 storms basically only develop as sea surface temperatures above 27 degrees. Looking at recent storms that have come across the North Atlantic, we see here that these really developed also at these very high sea surface temperatures. For example, also Florence here, preliminary results that really show that, yeah, the sea surface temperatures were quite high. Looking then at the sea surface temperatures that we're currently seeing, we see that under the present conditions in blue here, it's rather extreme that we have these high sea surface temperatures. But at 1.5 as well as 2 degrees, quite a shift towards these extremes is quite likely, which then entails that should storms develop, it's very, very likely that these actually increase to very high intensity storms. It must be noted that the modeling of tropical cyclones is really very have not necessarily been able to resolve in detail those storm tracks, and those high resolution models are just becoming available that actually are able to resolve the cyclone development in more detail. And I guess the statement has been around for a while that it's likely that storms are expected to increase in intensity, but potentially the frequency is going to be reduced. But those new results really show that unfortunately this is unlikely to be true, and it's there's a high potential for the frequency of storms developing as well. And in combination with those higher sea surface temperatures, quite likely that we're going to see an increase in those intense storms as well. Another quite extreme development we're still currently seeing also in California, where quite historical wildfires have been raging, I guess, over the past months, with quite mounting intense economic impacts. Wildfires are usually a combination of factors, and it's quite important to note also that for example, the proximity to settlements, but also management are very important indicators of, or very important factors that contribute to the likelihood of a wildfire breaking out. But it's really been shown that at the aggregate levels, at the more global level, we really see that the atmospheric conditions play a really strong role in the likelihood of wildfires breaking out. Looking again at the effects of climate change on these recent extremes, a study was actually able to show that in line with together with drying conditions in the regions has really led to an increasing aridity of the fuel that's available for these wildfires, which is a really important indicator or contributor to the likelihood of wildfires happening. So there's about a 50% increase in that fuel aridity as a consequence of atmospheric conditions notable in California, which has led to a doubling of the cumulative forest fire area since the 1980s. And along with increasing warming and aridity in the area, it's very likely that forest fires are also, or forest fire risk is going to increase over North America as well. As Michael mentioned before, a lot of research has been coming forward to contribute to the 1.5 report. So there's hundreds of new papers really looking in detail at specific sectors, specific world regions to really understand what the differences are. And go into everything, so I just want to highlight a few important aspects. In terms of ecosystems, both marine ecosystems as well as those on land, which of course are very important contributors to a livable planet as well. And especially for marine ecosystems in the tropics, studies could really show that the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of the fisheries or the catch potentials are quite substantial, and a really strong decline between 1.5 and 2 degrees is quite apparent in that study. Similarly, limiting warming to 1.5 as compared to 2 degrees halves the risks to land-based ecosystems and animals quite substantially. So the risks there reduce quite substantially as well. In the cryosphere, also we see potentially even stronger differences between the 1.5 and 2 degrees, because there's a potential for certain tipping points actually being reached along that. In the Arctic, for example, we see quite impressively here on that graph, I guess, the increase in a likelihood of a seasonally ice-free Arctic increasing between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So it's likely to remain a 1 in 40 years event under 1.5 warming, but it's quite certain that under 2 degrees it's actually going to be quite a frequent event. Similarly, looking at glaciers, already nowadays about a third of glaciers are unstable, meaning that they're losing overall mass, they're losing stored water, and that's expected to increase to about 50% of global glaciers under 1.5 degrees, but almost to 2/3 under 2 degree warming. So that has really strong implications for freshwater availability, for example, in the Himalayan regions that really rely on the freshwater storage there. And finally, as Michael mentioned as well, there's still obviously a topic of research, but risks to tipping points for ice sheet instabilities increase quite strongly with increasing warming. And while we're of course not certain that 1.5 would mean we're not reaching these tipping points, it just becomes much more likely with higher warming. And just to summarize again, a lot of the research that has come forward looking into the details of the impact differences there has really corroborated the initial results, showing that substantial differences in impacts really have to be expected across all regions of the world, and also across the different sectors. So yeah, that really highlights the need for us to embark on those limiting pathways, and we're really looking forward to the next talk then that will highlight these pathways for us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tabea, and Tabea will also be on the panel after our next talk, so if you've got any questions on any of that. Just to say, if any of you are on social media and want to put up anything about this, there's no hashtags specifically for this event, but Climate Analytics tweets at @CA_latest, and there's also, of course, the general hashtag Climate Week NYC, this fantastic gathering every year that brings together so many people in such interesting combinations. So we've had the why now from Tabea. Let's go on now to the how, and I suppose you could say the weather as well. Get to 1.5 Celsius? If so, how do we do it? What are the constraints? What are the advantages? What are the costs? This is so important that we've got not one but two speakers to come and do a double act on this. Bill Hare is another one of these people like Michael who needs really no introduction if you've been in this world for forever. In this particular context, Bill's co-founder and CEO of Climate Analytics, but we could probably drag up another 20 means of describing him, which would be equally as important. And along with Bill to talk about this is Jasmin, Cantzler, who's a policy analyst at Climate Analytics and leads the Climate Action Tracker project on the climate analytics side, which is something that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, looking at the sort of pledges and so on that governments have put forward. So, Jasmin and Bill.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to give a bit of a rundown, and we're going to do our bits and pieces along the way. Jasmin's going to try and choreograph the different parts of the presentation we're going to give. I'm going to be talking about is it possible, is it feasible to get to 1.5 degrees and or below? Opinions on this can differ a lot, but I'm going to go through the science and some of the developments that give rise to the belief that it is possible and that there are grounds for optimism. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about that in the questions session. So let's go to the next slide. On the technical side, this is a stylized view of the changes in the energy system under a 1.5 degree pathway. Don't look too carefully at the individual bands of the primary energy supply sources, coal, oil, gas, and so on, and non-CO2. This shows the kind of results that we're getting out of the present generation of integrated assessment models, embedding knowledge about the energy system in some detail, economic transformations and so on. And what it shows is the very phenomenon that gives rise to disbelief that we could get to 1.5 degrees. You notice the emissions rising quite quickly, and then they start to drop on the 1st of January 2020, or thereabouts, and they drop as fast or faster as they rose. So this overturns, 50 or 60 years of history in the development of the energy system. So it's not surprising that people can look at this problem with some disbelief. But I'm going to come back to that towards the end in the question time. What these models show is that it's technically and economically feasible to actually begin a transformation of the energy system to phase out first coal, then oil and natural gas, and bring in renewable energy and bring that black line down, the net CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, to close to zero or negative, as we'll get to, in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. First, we have to peak global emissions. There has to be then the initiation of a rapid decline, approaching zero emissions around 2050. The models vary, but let's face it, you can't get much away from 2050, zero emissions, and still get to 1.5 degrees or even well below 2. And we need negative emission technologies on this timescale as well, or a combination of negative emissions technologies and large land-based uptake of carbon through afforestation, reforestation, soils. This is an ongoing and active discussion, not just in the scientific community, but also in the community in general. So next slide, please. Now, what happened after Paris has already been alluded to by Michael and Tabea, that the scientific community really got very focused on the challenge that was put forward in the Paris Agreement, which is around the 1.5 degree number, and began to look not just at the impact differences in detail, but also at the feasibility of getting to a level of warming like 1.5 degrees. Previously, the lowest pathway we had was the green one here, RCP 2.6, I think, if I'm looking at that correctly, which was about a 2 degree, a hold warming below 2 degrees with a likely probability. After Paris comes a new IPCC pathway, RCP 1.9, which has been worked through the integrated assessment models. There's some 50-odd scenarios now in the forthcoming IPCC report in this way. And you see that in this pathway, you've got emissions going down a lot faster, in some models more negative, and this results in levels of warming around 1.5 degrees and up to 1.8 or so. So this is the kind of results that are coming out of the new generation of model runs. These are results from a paper by Yuri Rogulch and colleagues who've pulled together a suite of these pathways from different modelling groups. And what it shows is that it confirms within the terms of the modelled assumptions, the technological and economic feasibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. That is, the models for a number of socioeconomic assumptions, not all, find feasible pathways to actually get there. They also show very clearly something that we'll come back to at the end, which is that sustainability policies are also key to making 1.5 degrees feasible. In other words, integrating sustainability policies in transport, cities, agriculture and so on is an integral, if not essential, part of getting the policy set up in the energy area to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. I think that's been a motherhood statement in the scientific community for years, but I think for the first time in this new generation of models, there's been an attempt to unpack that and link sustainability, low emissions from an energy system pathway, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Slide.
Okay, but then the question remains, how do we get there, and what specifically do we need to do on the policy side of things? And I'm sure many of the great minds in this room have already done a great deal of thinking around that. As a climate action tracker, in the aftermath of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, We have done our thinking about that and have identified short-term steps that would be that would put the world on a pathway to meet the 1.5 degree temperature limit. For the sake of time, Bill and I have decided there will be a bit of a big ask to have you stay here the whole day going through all of these. So in the next few minutes, we will focus on the power sector and the transportation sector. But I still wanted to point this out here as a reminder again that we do need action across all sectors of the economy. So Bill, what do we need to do in the electricity sector?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Well, we did some modelling on this, and we discovered that actually it's not a novel discovery. This is a very universal finding from, I think, all of the model results that we know of, and certainly will be a strong finding, I think, in the forthcoming IPCC report, that you need to get CO2 emissions from the global energy supply system down towards zero in the period between 2030 and 2060, depending upon the model. Let's say in round terms around 2050, and that there needs to be, as part of this, a complete global phase out of coal or unabated coal in the power sector over that time frame. And I think this is quite a strong finding from all of the models that we're aware of, including the ones that we do and use ourselves. What that means essentially is that there can't be any new capacity installed and operated over its what would be considered a conventional economic lifetime, and there's a great risk of stranded assets. What this figure shows is from an earlier study which plots out the pathway for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, showing the emissions from current coal capacity if in the region in which those plants are at present they continued until the end of their economic life within those regions. It's an assumption. You see already you far exceed the 2 degree limit and well above the 1.5 degree limit. Any new and planned capacity, of course, just makes a bad situation worse. So this shows the challenge in the power sector going on. And I think now I hand back to Jasmin for some good news on this one.
Yeah, so if you look at that graph over there, it seems like quite a daunting task. But on the bright side of things, there is increased policy action on the ground to power past coal. So just as one example, during the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco just a few days ago, the Powering Past Coal Alliance welcomed 10 new states, regions, and cities into the alliance, which brings up the total tally of the alliance to 29 countries, 17 subnational governments, and 28 businesses that together support the phase out of coal by 2030 in the OECD and by 2050 in the rest of the world. And to give a few more concrete country examples, let's first turn to South Africa, where the new South African government just released a new energy plan that, if adopted, would shift away from coal, which would be quite significant development in a country like South Africa. Meanwhile, in Germany, we launched the so-called Commission on Growth, Structural Change and Employment, which is more commonly known as the Coal Commission, which aims to decide on an end date for coal power generation and close current emissions gap for its 2020 target. And then if we just move continents just once more, Chile announced an end to coal. It will not build any new coal-fired power plants and will develop a plan to phase out coal.
So I get back on the bad stuff. Part of this Paris Tango. Next click, please. What we have here is that you've seen some good news on the coal front. There's also some not so good news. We have a number of governments that are continuing with major investments in thermal coal. Japan, Indonesia, Turkey, Poland, for example, where the forthcoming COP is actually. These countries are pressing ahead with coal in circumstances where, at least for I think all of them, it doesn't make much economic sense. In other words, a lot of political economy issues are driving the continued investment of coal over the top of what would be a more rational economic situation. There are others who often stick together on climate change historically. It goes in cycles, but right now Australia and the US are back together in many ways on climate politics. That's right, Alden, we always love that situation. And of course, both are pushing coal, one way or the other. The Trump administration is famously pushing for coal. As we might see a bit later, it's not having much effect. The Australian government is now even thinking of investing in coal support. So also against all economic reason. And the line behind that are issues to do with the power of the coal industry, coal lobby, long-standing interests and so on. But nevertheless, important interests that will be difficult to overcome in the short run. Next slide. Here, we also have had thought about natural gas. Natural gas plays a big role in the power sector in a number of countries, plays an even bigger role in the industrial sectors for supplying heat and so on for processes. But what we see from the modelling is that we need to have an almost complete phase out of unabated natural gas by mid-century. So that's something that that is not well understood in the industry. You still feel and hear many in the power sector saying, look, natural gas is a cleaner fuel, we need it as a bridge to a cleaner future. And there is a certain amount of truth for that. But the bridge is not very long and it's not very high. And it's much shorter and lower than many have assumed, actually including myself, and probably Olden in the past, or Michael. People who've been in the business for a while have often assumed gas has a big role. But when we look at the modelling, actually it doesn't stack up anymore. So it's unlikely for there to be a very big role for gas. In the modelling...
Just for information, but in that context, unabated means what?
It means gas without carbon capture and storage. Yeah. Now, on the issue of carbon capture and storage, our assessment also is that there's unlikely to be a big role for natural gas with carbon capture and storage because of a series of changes in the power sector. There have been significant advances, to keep natural gas in the system, you would have to have big advances in reducing methane leakages. You would have to have overcome the economic effects of cheaper renewable energy. So renewable energy and modern power system management means that it becomes very, very difficult to imagine a company investing not just in gas turbines, but in novel carbon capture and storage technology with all that goes with that. And we don't see very many power markets where that looks at all likely. Even in power markets where, say, 5 years ago you thought that might be the technology of choice, it doesn't look like that's going to be the case anymore because the alternative is getting cheaper and cheaper. And the CCS technology has simply not kept up with that, has not been deployed at scale, and there's a growing scepticism in the industry about that. Next slide, please. Now, the reason, the big dynamic that's going on out there that gives reason for some optimism about getting to this 1.5 degree limit or anything close to it is the developments in the power market. And we're seeing in many places that, particularly for coal, renewables are already cost competitive in many applications and many regions, not in all places and all times, but definitely becoming almost a universal statement. But also say that becomes an issue for natural gas as well, that in many markets, including in US markets, we're seeing solar PV plus storage beginning to outcompete peaking gas turbines in a market that many of us would have thought, yeah, that's for gas for many years to come. So that's also a changing dynamic. It's not just in the US, we've seen this in Australia, in the UK and other places. So what's driving this are the lowering costs of renewables. Photovoltaics have declined very rapidly in the last few years, and ongoing reductions in prices are occurring. Lithium-ion storage, which is of course not the only storage medium or technology out there, but the costs of that have dropped as well quite dramatically and are projected to continue to drop. Lithium-ion is not just used in cars, it's also used at utility scale. The biggest utility scale battery at present now is in South Australia. Tesla introduced that very quickly. It's been a major player in the energy market there, and already we're beginning to see more and more of these installations planned in different parts of the world, and they will become an integral part of a very modern electricity system in the future, outcompeting traditional sources of supply in more and more markets.
So as a consequence of what Bill just showed here, many of the emissions projections for countries have already been revised downwards or in the process of being revised downwards. Most fundamentally, given that we're here, and Bill hinted at that, is the United States. So the force of renewables here really prevails despite federal efforts in the opposite direction. Likewise, in Chile, the record low costs for renewable energy paved the way for the adoption of the coal phase-out. And as a flip side to those revised emissions projections comes also that countries increasingly can look into increasing their targets. So the European Union is, for example, considering to ramp up its renewable energy target. And the really exciting thing about that is that as a next consequence, there is a lot of feeding ground to also ratchet up the NDC targets. It's a really powerful springboard, the technology developments that we see here. Because let's remember, all of us, that the NDCs were designed really with assumptions pre-2014, and with the rapid developments that Bill just showed, it's clear that they can be regarded as outdated, and there's a lot of room now for improving and strengthening ambition by 2020. And just to make this message a bit more stronger, I thought that it would be good to look into what the economics that we just showed sort of means in terms of actions on the ground. Overall, let's start with the global picture. So just in 2017, the number of solar projects alone equaled more than the net additions of coal, gas, and nuclear plants, which is quite a significant development. We see that in the industry sector, renewable energy is growing very strongly. So by early 2018, more than 130 leading global corporations had joined the Renewable 100 initiative. And I checked yesterday, and the tally is now up to over 152. So that just shows that the momentum is really still growing, and that this is just the beginning of the transition. We have 48 the climate vulnerable forum countries which have pledged to meet 100% renewable production as rapidly as possible. There are over 100 cities already now today that source at least 70% of their electricity from renewables. And utilities are also increasingly waking up to the changing landscape in the energy system, with many of the bigger utilities pledging to disengage from fossil fuel generation across the globe, with examples even in countries like Australia or the United States, where federal developments are yet to catch up to the new era. And now we're going to turn to transportation, and starting with a bit more harder part on freight trucks that is often still doubted even by people who follow EVs. So maybe, Bill, you start with that before I turn back to electric vehicles.
Right, I get to do the big toys again. Trucking and freight transport is a growing source of emissions in many countries, and ones that you traditionally find are hard to decarbonise in the models. But what we're seeing now in the market, particularly in the US now, but not only, are moves to establish electric lithium-ion trucks and fuel cell electric trucks driven by green renewable-based fuels, in particular green renewable hydrogen. The Anheuser-Busch company has started a project to have its carbon emissions from the transport of its products, beer and other drinks, of course, reduced to zero by 2025, and has initiated an order for a substantial number of fuel cell electric vehicles linked to a system of renewable hydrogen generation. One can view renewable hydrogen as, in a sense, liquid sunlight. It's converting sunlight into a highly transportable and effective energy carrier medium, one which also those in my generation in the energy community would have been sceptical about 5 years or so ago, but I've seen heads nodding, but now we've learnt that actually technology's changed. It's cheaper, it's easy to do, many of the storage issues have been solved, and fuel cell electric trucks are now becoming a very big possibility. The US manufacturer Nikola has an order for 9,000 already globally, and I think that's going to have a big impact on the market. What is very interesting in terms of a rapid transition, not just in the US, but in other places, is that the payback time for these trucks appears to be of the order of 2 years. In other words, moving out of traditional diesel, being one of my student jobs, driving big diesel trucks in the outback of Western Australia. I'm very interested in the transition possibilities for this particular transport medium. It applies also to buses and other large transport vehicles in a very cost-effective way, has a whole supply chain that is very potentially interesting to employers and regions.
So now turning back to light-duty vehicles, there's even more action there. Many different actors starting to adapting to an electric future. So again, starting with a bit of the global numbers, what do we see? So 2017 marked a new record with over 100 million electric vehicles sold, with more than half of those global sales in China, which just underscores the importance that China has in the transition of the transportation sector in that regard. The total number of electric cars on the road surpassed 3 million worldwide, which is an expansion of over 50% from 2016. So while we're still definitely in the sort of early uptake of the curve, if you will, there's a lot of action happening. And just here, the picture on the left, which is also where I kindly borrowed the parts of the title for the slide, is that more than 60 states, cities, and businesses have committed to a zero emissions future and have called for a so-called end game for the fossil fuel vehicles. And we already see some very bold and powerful policy signals as well, with some countries calling and have decided on a fossil fuel end date. So from a certain point in time, they will stop selling fossil fuel cars, which is a very strong signal to really try to drive the market in a specific direction and to guide developments that are underway. Other countries like Germany, Ireland, Japan, Portugal, and others have set official targets for specific sales in time for electric cars. Given that we're here, at least 8 states in the United States also have set themselves goals for the uptake of renewable of EVs. And then there are also cities who are driving the change as well to aim to have fossil fuel free streets at around 2030, including cities like London, Los Angeles, Paris, Rome, Cape Town, and Mexico City. So just to stress that this is clearly still in the early adoption phase, but it's moving very rapidly, and there are many players out there who are driving the change. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jasmin, for that great bit of information. I'm just going to go through now, recap on that horrendous stylized figure I showed you of the energy system and the emissions dropping rapidly. To summarize that again, that scientific research, I think, is very solidly showing that emissions simply have to drop very rapidly, peaking no later than around 2020, which is a major challenge, not impossible, but definitely looking difficult at present. And then emissions have to halve every decade thereafter to reach zero by around mid-century. That's the challenge that we've got, which is not insignificant. Next slide. Let's just wrap up now with some of the insights that I emphasize we have taken from our work on low emission pathways. Some of these messages may or may not appear in the IPCC report forthcoming, but they're drawn from the literature that has been examined. So one of the strong messages is that investment has to shift towards low carbon and renewable technologies quite rapidly, and including energy efficiency. That electrification of the transport sector is essential to this. If you can't electrify the transport sector in one way or the other, including through renewable hydrogen and fuel cells, then you have a very difficult task, even holding warming to 2 degrees. And that overall, the consequence is that rapid decarbonisation of this coupled energy and transport system needs to reach zero by around mid-century. So in these scenarios, we see renewables reaching 60 to 80%, non-biomass renewables, by 2050. Very big change from the present. Next slide. I've already mentioned that sustainability is a key enabling factor coming out of the model assessments of reaching 1.5 degrees. It's also clear that 1.5 degree development paths have very large benefits, including avoided climate damages, crops, health risks and so on. And the co-benefits of action include reduced air pollution, which has significant benefits for health and, in many regions, agricultural productivity. And you also happen to eliminate a number of the problematic and damaging consequences and risks of the fossil fuel supply system, as we have seen a bit in the Carolinas recently, actually. The sustainability challenges, and there are trade-offs, do exist, but what the literature is showing that with foresight and planning and care, these challenges can be managed. So I think they're the messages that we're taking away, fairly optimistic messages we're hearing. I'm aware that there are counter views on that, but I'm keen to hear those in the question time. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Now can I ask all of our panellists to join me, if you would, at the front? We're running slightly behind time, but we'll have sort of 20 minutes or so for Q&A now. Perhaps, Michael, can I just start with one question to you? I mean, you alluded right at the beginning to this making the case for a transformation compatible with a 1.5 Celsius pathway. Have you heard that? Have you heard a case that you think, let's say, sane rational governments, not all of them, but sane rational governments will take away and think, well, we better do that then?
Some governments will take away the message that they ought to get going on this. Look, the world seems to be split up into governments that are we've got the U.S. I don't know. I can't predict. My president could get up next week and decide he's a big fan of climate change for all I know. I just seriously doubt it. So there is that the set of embedded interests, which is a big drag on the transformations that we need. Then there are governments which are looking at the opportunities, as you could say China has, and wants to get out ahead of things. But even there's a lot that isn't perfect, and and the government can't, snap its fingers, although it could do it better than they can in some of the democracies, maybe, for better or worse, and make stuff happen. And then there are countries that, would love to see this global transformation occur, but don't have a lot of leverage on it at this point. So I think you're going to see a mixture of responses, from a yawn to, boy, we really have to get going. And, in the end, if the renewable energy revolution keeps going, if the technology, particularly on storage, if that comes, if the prices keep dropping, it'll be a lot easier. But in the end, governments at all levels have to get their act together and do a number of things which can be very tricky. So my skepticism is not on the technology and not on the price, it's on the governance part of the issue.
Excellent. So we've got time now for your questions, your comments. There's a microphone going around. Just say who you are and where you're from. Yes, lady, from the back. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Johanna von Braun. Up to 2 weeks ago, I was working for a not-for-profit out of South Africa that is working on environmental justice. And we've been doing a fair bit of litigation, including in Kenya, on the coal plant that is being built there in Lamu. My question is actually, we've now focused a lot on governments. What is the role of other institutions in this? Like, for us, it was key that the African Development Bank was continuing to make a commitment on coal. And I was wondering how some of the work that you're doing, particularly from the Analytics Institute, is focusing towards climate analytics, the role of actors such as multinational, multilateral investment banks and development banks and other financing institutions.
That's probably something we can also take into the second panel of the day, but Jasmin or Bill, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. What we've tried to do actually is work on showing multilateral banks, including the one you just mentioned, that there are significant economic consequences of climate change, in particular in Africa, and they're adverse and they affect the objectives of the banks, which is to, in the end, alleviate poverty. Obviously, the case of Kenya shows that there's still a long way to go in teaching the development banks and those who support the private finance aspects of these investments that this is investing in coal is the wrong way to go. In this particular case in Kenya, I would say this is not an economically rational decision to invest in this particular technology. It's got a lot of political economy elements behind it, which in effect enabled banks such as the ADB to support this kind of investment. And this points to the kind of governance issues which Michael was mentioning. And they're not just about governance issues in Kenya, they're also about the responsibility of governments who are promoting or supporting the technologies that are to be built and deployed in countries like Kenya with export guarantee facilities and so on. So this is a complex problem, and one which is not limited to this part of Africa. I would say if you look at the carbon numbers, where the likely source of real emissions growth is going to happen that could really threaten 1.5 degrees, in the short run you'd need to look at Southeast Asia. Very big problems going on there with a constellation of Japan, Korea, Australia and others supporting massive build-ups of coal, along with Chinese state-owned utilities or companies in there as well.
Another point.
Jeff Poten from Columbia University. Can you speak a bit about the impact of residual loading and existing loading of carbon in achieving the 1.5 degree goal? And also, can you speak a bit about the role of forest carbon? I know much of the discussion today has been on energy systems, but I think there's a tremendous potential with forest carbon as well. Thank you.
What was the first part, the residual?
The residual loading from existing carbon loading, how that mitigates against achieving the 1.5.
The existing carbon burden in the atmosphere.
Okay, so yeah, it raises an issue which I think is a question that didn't come out so clearly in the slides that were shown after I spoke, which is that as was clear after the fifth assessment report, there are a lot of trade-offs involved in taking advantage of the potential of any of the carbon storage options that involve the biosphere. We've got trade-offs between land for carbon, storing carbon, land for food, some land for energy crops that some people will argue for, although I have my problems with it. And how it's a very tight box, and making that transition work while at the same time realizing that keeping carbon standing that's already there in trees, for instance, and in the soils associated with the trees is an important reservoir that needs to be protected. How you're going to make all that work is just not clear right now. Right now, we're doing a lot of foolish things and going ahead and not for agricultural purposes, and then you can argue, oh, the technology is going to get better, things are going to move in the direction of a more efficient, less greenhouse gas rich agriculture, but it's just another one of those things which get in the way, and if it were appropriately managed, you probably could meet all criteria, including sustainability, and make it all work. But then actually making it all work is not easy, and it requires not just sort of disaggregated doing the right thing, but it requires governments paying attention and setting some rules down, and it's one of the difficulties.
And that's a whole new question of financing also, isn't it, that we might come on to in the second session, because all the while, for example, if a bank is financing energy, the question is, do you finance old energy or new energy? But there's clearly demand for energy in that particular country. But how do you finance the negative emissions stuff, which actually has a global benefit? Entirely new question. Billy wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think that just to, let's say, summarise what Michael was saying, the residual load, the burden of carbon in the atmosphere now is so high that in order to limit warming below 2 degrees, and even more for limiting it to 1.5 degrees, if you look at what you can do on the energy system side, getting to zero emissions by 2050, but you're still left with a lot of emissions from agriculture, industry and so on, and a lot of carbon left in the atmosphere you need to take out. And so that's the negative emissions discussion. And part of that can be achieved with land-based activities, which can be positive for the environment, for biodiversity and so on, sustainability. But as Michael alluded to, if you go too far, then you're going to create conflicts with biodiversity, water supply, food, and so on. So this is a challenge. However you cut that, the land sector won't be sufficient, so you need negative emissions technologies. And the models used at present, the technology of choice is biomass energy carbon capture and storage, which is often rolled out at massive scale in the models, probably unlikely to be possible in practice at the scale in some of the models, but there are other technologies to take CO2 out of the air, including direct air capture, enhanced weathering and so on, which are becoming more economically possible. Direct air capture, also something that anyone who did Energy 100 20 years ago would have said, oh, forget it, this is insane. No, actually, the understanding that's changing as well. Technologies to do this has got cheaper, and the very rapid reductions in power prices in renewable systems has provided the opportunity to actually roll in direct air capture technologies cost effectively in future systems. So, and there's a variety of other ways of cutting this as well, and a variety of new carbon storage technologies being developed. So I think this is a moving target, but one that we need to be aware of, and it's correct that somehow a pricing mechanism needs to be created. But as soon as you have a trading system or a carbon price, then you are going to create incentives for investment in these. And you already are seeing companies beginning to invest in the belief that carbon prices are going to rise or that trading systems will come. So there's a Swiss company beginning to roll this out in Switzerland, and there are other experiments going on around the world, including in the US in this area.
Can I just make one important point? I generally agree with the way Bill framed it, but with one difference, which is while we can see the reductions in renewable energy prices, I personally am not convinced about a large-scale global air capture system yet. It's too early, and that's one place we have to get very lucky. It has to have, the price reduction has to happen soon. You have to have a world that's willing to do this at a huge scale, and that's a much bigger question mark than just the future of renewable energy, which is going to be just fine. So you pointed to the overburden in the atmosphere. That really is the question, and my point being the biosphere can't make up for all that, which is what Bill said also, by the way. Right, so there's your uncertainty.
Another question, another comment? Yeah, right at the back, please. Thank you.
Based upon your professional, intellectual capabilities, I just want to find out what is your take on the effect of 1.5 degrees not being changed on small island states. I mean, we heard a lot of arguments on these things and the sea rise. I just want to get your take on this.
Tabea, would you like to comment on that? It's an impacts question, I think, first.
Yes, sure. So it's a huge question, and depending on how many hours I'm allowed to respond to that, we could. No, I mean, obviously it's a huge challenge, and maybe just to put that into a bit of a perspective, also linking that to pathways, I guess, of sea level rise. Sea level rise is quite a special case of an impact, essentially, because it really matters of when we actually peak emissions and when temperatures are stabilized, and if we actually have an overshoot, or if we do manage to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, and when that actually happens, because the energy that's put into the system essentially will lead to sea level rise that actually continues for a long time to come. And depending on when we actually manage to stabilize temperatures, additional sea level rise increments will actually we will face those towards the 2300s. off the top of my head, I think each additional 5 years of delay in actually stabilizing temperatures leads to around 20 centimeters of additional sea level rise at least, and that's kind of the median conservative projections, and that obviously I think is one of the most important aspects for small island states to really keep in mind when we make impacts and those pathways of temperature stabilization.
You also mentioned fisheries in your talk today, and I'm guessing also that coral reef decline is another impact between 1.5 and 2 that would have potentially massive implications for some small island states.
Absolutely, yeah. That's actually one of the other big areas where we see very large differences in impacts, where it's quite likely that at a 2 degree or virtually certain actually that a 2 degree warming would mean essentially that all coral reefs would face long-term damages, whereas at 1.5 degrees there's still a slight chance that some of the coral reefs might be able to survive, even though still significant impacts have to be expected. And that, of course, beside the fact that a coral reef in itself is something worth preserving, it obviously also has quite a lot of functions for fisheries, but also as a protective function for coastal systems and the whole system.
More questions? Yes. Let's take the chap in the second over here. Yeah, then I'll come back to you.
Hi, I'm Andres Chang from CDP. In terms of tracking progress toward these scenarios that you've laid out, I'm wondering what sort of strategies you have moving forward, whether those have been incorporated into the Climate Action Tracker, and also the challenges that you've been facing.
Jasmin?
Yeah, sure. So as Climate Action Tracker, we once a year aggregate all of the current policy developments that we observe and then calculate a global warming estimate. And currently that stands at 3.4 degrees warming by 2100, which is actually the first time that we really observed climate action, primarily in India and China, to really drive down the emissions projections. So we see some action already translating into a lower estimate. So we track that on a global scale as well as the national developments. We also have a decarbonisation portal which tries to track more on a sectorial basis the developments that occur in terms of activity and intensities. So there are quite a number of measures where we try to keep tab on the developments that are underway.
Thanks. Another question over here, please.
So we've been seeing a lot of great progress on policy recently. There's a lot coming from national actors and subnational actors, plans like the 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 that New York is pursuing. A lot of these plans don't necessarily meet the 1.5 degree goal or even the 2 degree goal. So I guess my question is, how do these policies play a role in meeting these goals? And is there a way we can incentivize more extreme policy, or does this have to come not from governments but perhaps from a bottom-up approach and whatnot?
Michael, would you like to?
So, yeah, I am personally a big fan of disaggregation of action in the sort of sectors and aspects where it can make a big difference. So, we love to see those individual cities coming out and having plans. In the U.S., the states are very important, and in the U.S. and probably elsewhere in the world, the subnational units actually can have an influence of driving national policy. Nevertheless, as I think Bill mentioned it, ultimately you need a price on carbon, and that probably, in some systems at least, isn't going to come from a bunch, 50 different in the U.S., 50 different prices on carbon. It's going to be done at the national level, if it's going to be done at all. So if those individual disaggregated efforts, not just in government, but in, as someone mentioned, NGOs and all the other firms, wind up being coordinated in a way which applies pressure to the national governments to do what they were paid to do, it's going to be an important factor in making all this hang together and really work. And right now in the U.S., it's about all we have.
Right. Question over there.
Yeah, my name is Aaron Muturi from Kenya. Now, I wanted to ask about engagement of other stakeholders. What are we doing to engage others? Because we know there are many other environmental lobbyists, and several things are being put in place, like Kyoto Protocol, like about Rio. All these things, we need to see how we can have a coordinated approach so that we move towards a common goal. We have to move and see if these things are on course. And if they're not on course, we can suggest alternatives. Let's say if Kyoto Protocol is of no use by now because of whatever is happening to the climate changes, we can also suggest an alternative. Thank you.
Have you got any particular groups of stakeholders that you're thinking of that you would like to see involved? Do you have any particular groups of stakeholders that you think ought to be involved, that you'd like to see involved?
Yeah, like maybe let's say UNEP, let's say IFCC, then, all those other environmental lobbyists.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Bill.
I guess what you're talking about is, in some sense, trying to align sustainability interests, stakeholders and groups in society who are concerned about individual sustainability issues and aligning their efforts in a way with efforts to protect climate change, biodiversity, build healthy cities. And I think that's a constant challenge given the complexity of the issues. And I know a lot of organisations do a lot of good work in that area. And I think that it's up to everyone actually working in a stakeholder to be aware of what's going on in other sectors and to find ways of cooperating to find common synergies and overcome some of the adverse trade-offs. We all know that if you start talking about a major energy transformation opportunity, then the people who are working at a coal-fired power plant are going to say, well, actually, what about us? So this is a transformation challenge, and I think we have to be aware of that, because at the end of the day, changes have to be politically feasible and they have to be sustainable, socially and economically sustainable pathways found to the transformation. And that can also apply in agriculture or in rural-based communities where similar challenges are being faced. So I think that's something we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, Germany's coal phase-out commission, to me, is quite an interesting development in that way, because if they get it right, that could potentially be a model that could be rolled out, best practice in other situations worldwide as well. Gentleman there, and then I think we'll probably move to the coffee break after you, sir, I think.
So I'm Franz Bezik. I work for Procter & Gamble, a consumer goods company. My question is, it looks like there's a optimistic pathway to 1.5 degrees to what I call consumption-based emission, production-based emissions. How about consumption-based emissions? Are we free to consume, or it's all coming on top as a bonus if we do well as consumers? But it feels like we can solve the world without the consumer having to do anything. So I wanted to have a point of view. It's cool, but at the same time,
some of that fits in with the sustainability criteria that you were talking earlier about.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the issue, I guess. Without getting into the ins and outs of consumption versus production accounting, the top level accounting I showed here of emissions actually means that you've got to make the changes at the consumption level. And so if you go through step through each of the sustainability development goals, then you will find ways in which companies and consumers need to change their practices and, in some cases, behaviour in order to modify those ways of consuming services and goods. And you're seeing an increasing movement, for example, against plastic around the world now, partly in reaction to the horrible scenes of massive amounts of plastic pollution in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or Indian Ocean. And all these things need to happen, and companies need to be really looking ahead. And we gave a really good example. I was very excited by this Anheuser-Busch example, actually, of a company that's actually developing an entire new industry of renewable hydrogen-powered trucks. Not that it does renewable hydrogen-powered service stations itself, or it does fuel cell electric trucks itself, but it's created a market. And it's done it in the present political environment in the US. And I think, well, if that sort of company can make that kind of decision and have such a big impact, what else could a few other big companies make as well?
Fantastic. Well, we'll leave the panel there. And if we take about sort of 10 minutes for coffee, that means we're starting the second panel about 5 minutes behind schedule, but I think that should be fine. So can I ask you, just before we break, just to put your hands together, if you would, in the usual way for our panellists, Dr. Tabea Lissner. Great. See you after the break.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, could you take your seats again, please? We're going to start with the second panel of the morning. Looks like you're in the middle of Justin.
No worries.
Michael will join us when he's ready. Okay. Well, good morning. Welcome back to the second half of Cool Tips for a Living Planet, where basically we find out how to do it. Because I think the first session has set the rationale for a 1.5 Celsius transition and the scale of the challenge. Obviously, if this is to be delivered, then a lot hangs on finance. In the last panel, it's about how do you actually stop finance going into stupid things like coal and get enough finance flowing into sensible things like renewable energy and electric cars and sustainable cities and all the other stuff. So Michael Oppenheimer has joined us again, but first of all we're going to hear from a couple of people who are very actively involved in the finance field. So first of all, Helen Mountford, who's Director of Economics at the World Resources Institute and the Programme Director for the New Climate Economy Initiative, this great initiative that's produced some of the best numbers on the costs but more importantly the benefits of a transition to a low carbon world. And Justine Lee-Bell, who's with the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm lucky enough to share an office building with Justine, actually in London. It's a small world. And Climate Bonds Initiative is one of the organisations that's actually going out there and doing it. It's actually putting some of these deals into place concretely in different parts of the world that's actually helping to drive finance into the right place. So first of all, we're going to hear a few words from Helen and from Justine, and then it'll be over to you again for your thoughts. So Helen.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks everybody here today. I think the opening sessions this morning were fantastic in setting this scene. And one of the things I do want to highlight is some of the economic benefits of this transition, some of the latest evidence that we've collected in the new climate economy in our work, and also how we see we can accelerate action over the next 2 to 3 years. What are the opportunities to really accelerate action? So first of all, we did release a new report of the new climate economy just a couple of weeks ago. So you can find that online. I have been carrying around copies to wave around, and I got rid of all the rest of my ones this morning. So I'm afraid I can't. But if you search for New Climate Economy 2018, it's part of the work of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, which is made up of 28 former presidents, finance ministers, economy ministers, heads of major companies, who really are looking at these issues and how we can achieve both climate action, ambitious climate action, and economic growth together. And then as we develop the reports and the evidence base, they take this out around the world and try and galvanize and motivate political will and political action. So very much addressing some of the challenges the last panel discussed on how do you get governments to step up. So the latest report we have found that if we enhance action on climate change, if we take bold action over the coming years, we could have economic benefits compared to business as usual amounting to $26 trillion between now and 2030. So an enormous economic benefit from this. And we know that this is actually an underestimate. It doesn't even cover some of the benefits we would see. For example, in the model, we're not able to reflect the devastating costs, human and economic, of climate change. So the business as usual model, the business as usual scenario should actually be lower in terms of the economic growth, and we're not able to reflect that. But even without that, we find net economic benefits of $26 trillion. We also find that going to more ambitious climate action can deliver jobs. It could deliver 65 million new low-carbon jobs in 2030 alone. That's basically equivalent to the total workforce of Egypt and the UK today. So significant new jobs. It would also help through reduced air pollution to reduce premature deaths. 700,000 premature deaths would be avoided in 2030 based on this climate action. And then finally, one of the benefits we highlight, which is important on the financing side, is that if you do some of this action, not all, obviously you need a range of policy instruments to get there, but some of the action through removing fossil fuel subsidies that are sending price signals the wrong direction and putting in place a reasonable carbon price, you can actually raise as much as $2.8 trillion in revenues or proceeds from these instruments in 2030. So that's quite a lot in terms of funding, which governments can actually use to address other social priorities, whether it's poverty alleviation, whether it's employment, health benefits, education, or investing in low-carbon technologies and resilience, for example. $2.8 trillion in 2030, and that is basically equivalent to the GDP of all of India today. So that's enormous benefits, economic, financial, and social benefits of moving towards a much bolder climate action scenario compared to what we have today as business as usual. So our Global Commission basically has said this is the growth story of the 21st century. There are no other growth stories. There are none that are sustainable and achievable and can actually put us on the right path. This one can deliver the economic, the social, and critically also the environmental benefits we need. Now the challenge is we're not yet going fast enough along the path to achieve this. One of the things they do emphasize, and we've highlighted in our report, we have 200 pages of basically examples and evidence and proof points of where we're seeing successful action on the ground in sectors, in different countries around the world, and as again highlighted this morning by different actors, cities, states, businesses, investors. And so we do highlight there's a lot of momentum on which we can really build this new climate economy. Some of this includes the renewable energy commitments, and as was mentioned, we have something like 150 major multinational companies that are now committed to 100% renewable energy. We have more than 480 companies that have committed to set science-based targets based on the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's up almost 40% since just last year, so significant improvements and momentum there. And I think one of the things that's most exciting to us, and we highlight in the report, is that the finance sector, at long last, is really waking up to the opportunities and also the risks of continuing with business as usual. And one of the main reasons it's woken up is the report of a task force on climate-related disclosures that released its recommendations last summer in 2017. And since that report was launched, we've had 390 companies with market capitalization of over $7 trillion that have committed to the recommendations of this task force. So they're committed to moving forward with releasing, disclosing information around the financial risks associated with climate change. The investments that they're making, the companies, that what they're doing, aligning their prospects with climate change. So understanding how climate change will affect those businesses, those investments, and where the opportunities are to move towards low carbon going forward. So that to us is a major wake-up call. It's a major shift, and we're seeing that investors around the world, whether it's the private investors, whether it's countries like Ireland and others, are starting to shift investments accordingly. So there's a lot of momentum on which to build, and what the Global Commission has done is highlight some of this evidence base, some concrete examples of where we're seeing progress and the benefits of that progress. and then also highlighting how we can actually move forward urgently over the next couple of years. We see a really critical window of opportunity over the next 2 to 3 years where we can step up and need to step up action in order to put ourselves on the right pathway. And so that's the main messages from the report. Richard, I might stop there and happy to continue discussing as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Lots of big numbers there. If you've got any questions about them, just hold those questions for now and come back afterwards. Now, Justine, you, I know from personal experience, you're always jetting off to exciting parts of the world, Brazil and so on and so forth. What are you actually doing with Climate Bonds Initiative? What's happening? What effect does it have?
Well, I think just building off of, can you hear me? Okay, so yeah, just kind of building on some of the optimism that Helen has brought to the table here is that, we know what the challenges, we know what the costs are. The hope that we have really comes down to the capital that we currently have access to that we've never had before in history. And at the moment, we sit on roughly about 100 trillion of assets under management on the global stage, and that is our pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance industry, etc. And so when we look at what we had heard earlier today around what needs to be done, we have to figure out very quickly on exactly how we're going to finance that. And I'd argue to Helen's point that actually the finance sector has been woken up even before the task force even came into play. And I would say that the market that we work at and drive forward over the last 10 years has led to things like the task force and also waking up governments around the world. So the take-home message here is there's hope. I agree completely with Helen. Are we moving fast enough? I would say no. But I think a lot of what we have to recognize is that this is an education process and understanding that we are late on. We are late on understanding what the climate science is. We are late on understanding what needs to be financed, what it means to be green, et cetera, et cetera. So I do say that the role of government is absolutely critical. We will not be able to do it without them. And in the sense of what role they actually play will depend on the type of market. So in the US, it should be a very hands-off versus another jurisdiction like China where the top-down approach is working very effectively. So what has developed to date? We have a bond market. So bonds are what institutional investors understand very clearly. It's debt. It is where issuers of all different types, public sector, the like, will issue debt that investors will invest in. They will make a return. And what we're seeing in it comes down to exactly what they're financing, which is 100% eligible projects and assets, primarily addressing climate change head on. And of course, there's a very strong transparency and disclosure element that comes out of that. This is what investors are really appreciating. And when we have the rise of the millennial coming in, they're asking the questions and their pockets are going to be deep. At the moment, we're still dealing with old institutional capital that is still trying to figure out what those questions are. But ESG mandates are rising, knowing where our money is going, understanding how that's addressing environmental and social governance issues is why we now have a market that has gone from $3 billion US to over 400 billion in a 5-year period of green bonds. The latest report that CBI has put out, State of the Market report we do with HSBC, this will give you the backstory, it will give you the trends, it will give you who's issuing, what's issuing, where is it happening around the world. So I do highly encourage you to download that on our website. I don't have enough copies to share, but we launched that this week and we do it every year. And so I just want to kind of wrap up with a few points here that some of the things that we've actually seen coming out beyond just the fact that investors are now investing, the benefits that we've seen in these last 5-year periods, what I would say, is a better understanding of what exactly do we mean by green. I would argue we still have a long way to go before we get ourselves within the 1.5, but there's a tremendous amount of work that is happening internationally, whether we are talking about the EU Commission, whether we're talking about China. China is leading this agenda, full stop. And they're the largest issuer. Green finance has become a fundamental strategy for meeting their 5-year plan, et cetera, et cetera. I'm afraid to say that on this side of the world, we are decades behind, and we have a lot to catch up. And so when we look at the better understanding of green, that has come from the rise of green bonds. the intersection of siloed institutions. Ministry of Finance is now talking to the Environment Ministry. We've got Treasury departments talking to the teams of sustainability that they hadn't done before. Those walls are breaking down, and better coordination is coming off the back of that. The role of government, we've had many step up to put in their own national green bond guidelines so they can start to benchmark locally, mobilize domestic investors, and start getting issuance happening locally, but also figuring out ways to connect those markets to the global markets. And we've had sovereigns, several of them, whether we talk about Poland, whether we talk about Lithuania, whether we talk about Nigeria, or France, or Belgium, they've all issued sovereign green bonds. And that in itself is a signal to their commitment, miles away from what they do need to do, but it's a signal that they are taking their climate action plan seriously. Some would argue that maybe Poland not so much, but that's a debate for another day. So I think what I'll do is just leave it at there, because I think we can probably draw out some more of it out of the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, one question I had, Justine, was for those of us who don't work with green bonds and so on, could you give us an example of, you know, one particular deal, if you like, one particular bond that's actually done something good that would not have happened if we hadn't had all of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, whether we've seen it in the developed world, let's just use the U.S., given where we are. We had the Metropolitan Transport Authority of New York, after their devastating interaction with Hurricane, do I have it right, Katrina? Was it this one that hit? Thanks, sorry, there are quite a few now that I lose track on which one. But anyways, when I was, and it wasn't actually the sustainability people getting in touch with me, it was the finance director. And he calls up and he says, look, we've got a serious problem, and I think this green bond stuff can help. I want us to be visible. I want us to start directing capital into becoming a more resilient transport system. Very progressive finance director, despite the challenges he faces internally within the public sector, identified within his $24 billion capital expenditure program, looked and carved out $11 billion of that could be captured into a green bond program, of which MTA is one of the latest issuers in the U.S. market on that. Why the assets? It's existing assets. It's rail. It's not stuff that's complicated here. The things that we're looking at is every major sector of the global economy, identifying what is the deep decarbonization of each, what are those investments, relying on the work that Climate Analytics does, the Potsdam Institute, even for Harvard and Princeton and the rest of them that are in this, we have to be able to draw out that science and underpin it with the IPCC. And the point being is that we've begun to better understanding that things that we're already having as an existing asset base, we can direct capital and do more of it. We need more public mass transit systems. We need to stop relying on high carbon intensive modes of transport, for example.
Yeah. Helen, one question I had listening to yours, you mentioned this figure of 26 trillion direct economic gains. Can you just break that down a little bit? Where does that come from? How do we realise that 26 trillion from direct sector?
I mean, there's a number of ways. We actually look at it, we've used a sort of modeling approach. It's the Cambridge Econometrics E3ME model, which looks at a number of different measures implemented in the economy. And what we find is as you go towards more low carbon, you're shifting away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, for example. Just in that area alone, you actually reduce a lot of the investment needs and the costs of upstream sourcing of fossil fuels. It's a huge cost to the economy, so that's one that goes down. Another is that we're looking at improved energy efficiency, whether that's in buildings or industrial energy efficiency, etc. So as you're doing that, you get savings as well in the economy. So that's another area where we see a big chunk of benefits. Beyond that, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, fossil fuel subsidies, removing those from the economy. Fossil fuel subsidies are a massive distortion. At the moment, the OECD and IEA estimate they're about $373 billion per year in subsidies to fossil fuels. So taking those out, that helps. So another area where we see real improvements is by going towards more compact, connected cities. This makes more livable, more attractive cities. It actually helps address a lot of social inequities. and challenges, but it also means that you need less infrastructure and less services out to very remote areas of these sprawling suburbs. So that implements savings in the economy as well. So it's the combination of these various different measures together that lead to a much more efficient, more effective, and more prosperous economy.
Michael, perhaps can I ask you for some sort of initial reflections on what we heard. I mean, when you were there back in kind of 1990-ish and you were helping draft the language in the UN Climate Convention, did you foresee then that we'd be coming to a time when we talked about delivering these things through green bonds and financial disclosure and so on?
No, I had no idea, to be frank about it. It's very interesting. Let me just comment on a few points that you made. Number one, and a point that was just made, which is that there's some way you need to get the big infrastructure investments that are going on, and which are, they're partly private, determined by private investment, but they're largely government driven. And how do you get a handle on that? And I point to two things. One is, I forgot the name of the initiative, but China's big global infrastructure investment. Belt and Road Initiative. Yes, that's it. How do you get that to be green? When we can influence investments at that scale, then we've made a big difference. And I worry about it because if you look at what happened, as was alluded to, I think, by Bill earlier, when China made this big move toward investing in taking over the renewable energy markets. As Bill mentioned, what they did is they offshored their expertise to the rest of Asia, guaranteeing essentially a big, or underwriting a big explosion through finance and through transfer of expertise in coal development in the rest of Asia. And no one knows exactly how that's going to balance out. But in the end, the benefit of China moving toward renewable energy, a lot of it's going to be offset by their actions in finance. So we have to worry about that. In the U.S., you have this terrible problem of us having this long-standing, spread-out development, which is antithetical to what needs to be done if you look at any of the scenarios we saw this morning. There's a lesson there, though, recently, which was kind of interesting. When the price of oil went up in the early to mid-2000s, there was all of a sudden, and it's probably not the only reason, a big transformation in the way particularly young people looked at the transportation system. And other things were going on, like eventually the financial crisis, which made the future look not too bright. And people stopped buying cars. Young people stopped owning cars. Young people stopped getting driver's licenses. There was a notable plateauing and even turn down. And a lot of that generation probably will never actually bother to get a driver's license or a car. On the other hand, the price of oil then went down, and you see an erosion of those favorable trends. So, price is always very important. It's one of the reasons 1.5 degrees is, in the end, going to be very difficult. How do you align these various things that are going on, these various mega trends, and make them get them to be timed and working in the right direction? Another one, again related to the finance issue, is if we have a goal of electrifying the transport system. What happens if that goal, or by the way, getting hydrogen-based cars, what happens if the electrification of transport gets out of kilter with the rate at which the renewable energy transition goes in producing electricity? Then you've got infrastructure which is ready to be friendly to electric cars, but the electricity is just as dirty as it was before, or not clean enough. And you're using hydrogen, maybe that's wound up being made as it is today from natural gas, and all of a sudden things didn't go right. So a lot of focus has to go into how finance can help synchronize the timing and the greenness of these larger global trends that are going. It's very difficult, but I think we have to look at this bigger picture. And then I'll mention one other thing, which hasn't been mentioned today at all, except that you did start to mention it, which is the relationship of finance to adaptation. Adaptation, we're all forgetting or maybe we haven't forgotten, we aren't talking about the fact that there's going to be a lot of ugly stuff happening, whether it's 1.5 warming, 2 degrees, 6 degrees, whatever happens. And finance has a big role to play in helping people defend themselves. And the coordination of finance, which you started to get into, is a very important aspect.
Thank you. I'm going to come to your questions now, if we may. Just a reminder that if you are tweeting or doing any other social media from this, the Climate Analytics handle is CA_latest, and the hashtag that we're using here is hashtag Climate Week NYC. Who's got a question? Or a thought, indeed. An observation. Yes.
Hello, my name is Karen Schroeder, and I'm doing a course in sustainable finance at Columbia University. And I've got, from years ago, a PhD in international political economy. And as much as I would like to actually believe that, you know, the ramp of green finance is fast enough, and you know, there are lots of people talking. It's a bit like the ramp of clean energy. We're starting from a very, very small base. Do you see, you know, exactly as Professor Oppenheimer said, we've got a very short period of time in which to do this. Do you see the supply ramping to meet the need? I won't say demand, because I'm not sure that the demand is quite there.
That growth figure you gave, Justine, was quite staggering. What did you say? 3 billion to 400.
So can I dive into that really quickly? Just, I think one of the things, I want to step back away from the finance for a minute, and I want to step away from the investors, because that's actually not the problem. There's more than enough money, and we have the financial instruments. Even if you're talking within the emerging economies, where the biggest story is going to be is coming out of India, China, Southeast Asia, LATAM, and how that's going to get connected to northern investors who sit on the capital. What we have is a capacity issue on the pipeline, on the projects themselves. Even if we know the technology, even if it's proven and tested, it's not. Project finance doesn't even exist in most parts of the emerging economies. It doesn't exist in LATAM. There's no standardized model of project finance. So to be able to get institutional capital, which is the only capital that I would argue is going to get us there fast enough, flowing that into these countries on top of just typical market conditions is what we're at. So I say with the development finance institutions, which that came up, and what we can do with them and what role they should be playing despite trying to stop financing coal, is providing that technical assistance to governments, subnationals, nationals, to build out what those pipelines are. One, on understanding what they should be financing, more rail, less high carbon intensive growth, or low carbon, or whatever, and being able to build that capacity so that there's project pipelines that can be packaged in different ways, funds, bonds, however, securitization vehicles, which taps into dealing with small-scale projects, single-handed renewable energy projects, too risky for institutional capital, package that, sell that off, whether domestically, to domestic buyers, or to the international. So I'll stop there, because I think, you know, I'm sitting here in all these different types of conversations talking about blended finance and all these really fantastic ways of getting the finance flowing, but it is limiting, because yes, we could definitely test that in China, we could definitely test that in India. Outside of that, you know, those project pipelines are thin, so we need to build them.
Helen, you must have looked at this as well, because having identified this direct economic gain that's just out there waiting to be plucked, the next question is, well, how?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, absolutely, and I can build a little bit on what Justine said there, and I think respond to some of the points Michael also raised. We do see, I mean, we emphasize this sort of 2 to 3 window of opportunity coming forward, and it's particularly around investing in the infrastructure of the future, both for resilience and for climate mitigation. And I think it is a combination of sort of boosting how we can invest in green, and as you said, the money is there, it's just actually in many cases it's shifting it from the brown. A couple of points on this. I mean, we see between now and 2030 trillion in infrastructure around the world, mainly in emerging economies and developing countries. Now that is more infrastructure than we currently have on the ground today. So you imagine all our infrastructure and double it. If we get that right, that puts us on the right track to compact connected cities, efficient industry and energy, livable, clean areas, and good land for agriculture, for forestry, and for ecosystems. If we get that wrong, we're on a very different track. Now that's in the next 10 to 15 years we're building that. The plans for those, what we're going to do with those are going to be developed in the next 2 to 3 years. So that's why we see from an economic case, it's really urgent to try and shift this perspective. I think some of the discussions we're having actually more finance ministers, some of the sectoral ministers. So the work that we're doing, the new climate economy work and having this global commission, it's made up of former finance ministers, current CEOs, heads of international economic institutions, some former presidents, because they're the ones who can talk to their peers about this. And so they're able to take this economic evidence that this is a better growth path. You know, it's sustainable, it's low carbon, it's resilient, but first of all, it's actually a better growth path, just economic growth path. They're able to take that and talk to them, because that is where I think we will start to see the MDB shifting. That's where we can actually engage on the Belt and Road Initiative and ensuring that it is green enough, sufficiently green, by saying this is the path that actually makes sense. So we're really trying to make a push around that. I do think a harder challenge that we see going forward is more around the behavioral shifts. And you mentioned, the U.S. and the sprawl that we have in the U.S. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of other countries go the same direction on cities. Not all, but quite a few have been going in that direction. In the U.S. alone, it costs something like $1 trillion per year to have sprawling cities. It's a cost to the economy and to individuals. So how do we shift away from that? I do think millennials are a different breed, and as you said, they're not getting their driver's licenses, they're not getting cars, they want to live in urban environments, they want to be able to walk and move by bicycle or scooter, electric scooter, they want that flexibility. So building on that and helping to develop the infrastructure that can help service that approach and making sure that moves forward quickly is one way to help accelerate that. But that is going to be an area where we have challenges, how we get those behavioral shifts to happen. So we're trying to work at all different angles here, but definitely from the new climate economy, a strong push is how can we convince the economic and finance decision makers that this is in their own interest. It's not just a greenie agenda, it's actually for them as well.
Great, thank you. More questions? Yes, at the back over there, please.
Hello, my name's Ian Fry from the Government of Tuvalu, and I'd like to thank Helen and Justine for a very interesting talk. There are some figures out on the costs of climate change. The insurance industry is doing that. I read a report recently saying that there's $1.7 trillion of unclaimed, uninsured damage over the last 7 years. So there is some figures out there, and that's uninsured damage. That's not including damage. Just I have 3 points. The second one is, on the issue of insurance, we in the Pacific are developing a Pacific Island climate change insurance facility. But one of the elements of this is a sort of novel approach is we're trying to establish a disclosure mechanism so that we, the vulnerable countries, can enter into this disclosure discussion, and highlight where the insurance industry generally is investing in fossil fuel and climate-exposed areas. So any help with that would be really grateful for that. The third element is this just transition. The Polish government are hoping to have a declaration on just transition for the next COP and released an early draft of it. And it's very basic in its form. And I think listening to your talk, there could be much greater development of that whole concept of just transition. So certainly reach out to you for that support on that regard as well. Thank you.
Any thoughts on it?
Just two quick ones in response. Thanks very much, Ian, and fantastic to hear what you're doing there in the Pacific Islands with insurance companies. It's interesting, in many cases, insurance companies have been the ones in the finance sector who got this earliest because they see the impacts of climate change and have to do payouts based on that. So I think They have been further ahead. I think raising and disclosing where they are still making investments that run counter to that is a fantastic initiative and one that's welcome. I do think we are moving to a different space there, and it is, you're absolutely right, Justine, it's been going on for longer. I think there was a step change from last year's TCFD recommendations, which has woken up the finance sector. But you also have things like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It's $1 trillion in assets. And it was built on the back of oil and gas revenues, right? That's how Norway generated the sovereign wealth fund. Well, they've already been pulling out for a number of years from investments in coal, and last year they recommended to the government that they also pull out the sovereign wealth fund from investments in oil and gas, which is what generated the sovereign wealth fund. But they're seeing these as risky going forward and not aligned with where we need to go on climate to achieve the kind of targets we're talking about in Paris, the 1.5C, et cetera. So, I mean, we're seeing quite a shift there. It's slow and it's still only a few front runners, but moving. On the just transition, I did want to say something about that too. I didn't highlight it enough in my remarks at the start, but for the Global Commission, they highlighted 4 immediate priority areas moving forward over the next 2 to 3 years. And one of those was actually a people-centered approach and the just transition. I think, Ian, you're absolutely right. This is fundamentally essential. It's particularly the case in the energy sector, but it's not just there. It's also in urban areas, it's in land use, it's in countries around the world. Ensuring that those who have helped to power our economies in the past, who have helped to feed our economies, as we transition to a more sustainable model, we engage them in the discussions and the solutions, and we find good mechanisms to transition are essential. And we actually highlight a number of examples. I think somebody mentioned before, I mean, Poland is definitely focusing on this, Germany and the coal transition there, but you also have Alberta and Canada, which has been having just transition dialogues. It's a fossil fuel-based economy and it's shifting away. Norway has done this, Scotland, Uruguay. We have the company Enel, an energy producer in Italy, which has to close something like 23 coal plants in the coming years. And they've been in dialogue with the coal workers and with the unions and with the communities there, and have decided that as they close those coal plants, they will stay in place in the communities in the region. They will either replace them with renewable energy where that is actually suitable and appropriate, so they can provide jobs to some of the workers who won't when the coal mining is no longer there. But if renewable energy isn't possible, they're looking at how to develop tech hubs there too. So they've made a commitment to the workers to do so. So I think it's really an essential element of actually tackling some of the political economy challenges. We won't get this transition to happen fast enough unless we're able to take a human-centered approach.
Great. More questions, observations? Did you have your hand up? Okay, sorry. Any more? Yes, back please.
Could you just give an example, please, of how green bonds could be used to fund mass transit in cities that are lacking it, say Houston?
It's a very good question. A lot of what we're seeing here is a refi model. So it's a refinancing of existing assets. So if it's new project plans, it would be very clear revenue models, past construction risk, before you could start getting green bonds involved. So it would still behave exactly the way that project finance would go, in the sense of bank lending, or however it would. In the case of the public sector side, it would be public money that would be used to start the project, and then using green bonds to refi on the back of that to then extend those lines, build out further developments of those projects. But I mean, by no means is Houston or any other city around here untouched on being able to leverage green bonds. I'll mention that within the U.S. muni market, green bonds, they are leading globally. Subnationals around the world do not have the luxury that the U.S. muni market has in their ability to issue debt. That has been devolved by federal government. You do not have that in even in developed nations, other places like in the UK, London can't just go and issue bonds. It has to be signed off by Treasury. So that's a really excellent starting point, of which now there's this need to educate, create market awareness and understanding, outside of places like New York and California, where we're seeing most of the issuance. California, public sector issuers are at $7 billion of issuance just in the 2017 year alone. New York was the same. Massachusetts did about $3 billion. So a lot of this money is being used for all various types of projects in the transport, water, energy sector. One of the biggest challenges that the muni world has in the U.S. is it's extremely inefficient, very bureaucratic, very slow, and very risk averse. So going into, and this comes down to a number of elements. There is a lot of fear on transaction costs and legal purposes and risks and so on, that taking on new things tends to be very difficult to be uptaked. So the understanding that this is actually not new, that this is part of their normal debt issuing program and cycle, is to then educate on, well, what are you currently financing that you need to attract more capital towards to be. You have seen many of the muni issuers become back, like San Francisco Public Utility. They've issued like 4 or 5 bonds now. They're setting up programs because they're getting new investors every single time they're putting a bond out, which is under the label.
Michael, you wanted to?
Yeah, let me make 2 comments. One on the question of how do existing firms deal with the need of a transition and anticipating it, and the other about the insurance market. And I seem to have been cast in the role of a cynic here, and I like that role actually. It suits me. And there's a difference between a cynic and a skeptic. Yes. You can be an optimist and a cynic too. You just have to realize where the power lies. And I was talking to a couple of political scientists earlier this week, which fed this natural side of me. And look, most firms that are incumbents in a market or dominant, they only disappear when they disappear. Yeah. They don't smoothly make a transition. And that's a raw, brutal political fact. It's hard to imagine big companies like Exxon, say, disappearing, but in the past, companies have either shrunk, disappeared, or shrunk down and transformed into something entirely different. It's painful. It's a question of raw political power, because incumbents like to dig themselves in and build walls and use their resources to keep things as they are. So always keep that in mind. The world we live in is a brutal place from the point of view of the people that have power and the people that don't have power, mostly. The other, which is a little different but also kind of it's more a realist view. Insurance company, I've had this conversation 1 million times for the last 30 years, and I've puzzled, why haven't insurance companies really taken the lead? The ones that are in the lead are the reinsurance companies.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's because the buck more stops with them. Yeah. And the insurance companies, they balance risk year to year. They don't give a damn really if the risks are changing on a 10 or 100-year time scale, because they can just redo the rates. The reinsurance companies get stuck with the big events, and even they have a limited desire to really fight this, because the governments actually wind up coming in, and especially in the U.S., and cleaning up the mess afterwards and picking up a lot of the gap between what's insured and what's not insured, or what the insurance companies can afford to pay and what they can't afford to pay. So, and that again, that function, which is just full of incentives to do things wrong, because it sends a signal, don't buy insurance because the government will take care of it. Those are the political facts of life that we have to deal with, and while at the same time trying our hardest to make this happen in a better way.
But it'll be interesting to see what actually, Moody's recently, the rating agencies, and what role they play here, because they are taking climate risk now into account. Even as closely as we're working with Moody's, I had no idea that even like currently they are taking that type of risk into play. They put out a report, I think it was a year ago now, you may have read it, which is downgrading state level credit if they don't take climate risk into their planning, right? And I think that's going to increasingly grow, and how that ends up playing out with the insurance industry will be, an interesting development. But I think it's a number of different players. It's a political one. Infrastructure is not tangible to the politician. it's short-termism. We actually have to figure out how we get this into short-termism thinking, because that we're not going to change overnight. We need more long-term strategies. This is what investors, at least the ones we deal with, the big guys, they love to invest in the institutions, public institutions and private, that are showing a long-term strategy, and they're all over it. And regardless if maybe it's weak on the climate side, in the green side, it may be delivering very little impact, but the fact that they're actually taking the steps towards this, they're providing the transparency disclosure of what they're financing, it gives them that long-term strategy feel. But we're in short-termism still that hold the power and control. So we have to think about how we infiltrate that into that type of thinking.
And of course, from the climate change point of view, that's also, you need the short-term decisions changed, don't you? There's no good changing them on 20-year time horizon. I think we'll take one more, I saw one more hand at the back. Let's take you, sir, and then we'll wrap up, I think, because we're bang up against time. So.
Thank you very much. I'm Luca Bergamaschi from E3G. Just two questions, perhaps with some overlappings with the session before. One is on climate impacts. So the impacts of climate impacts on growth and the estimates. So whether you and the report, new climate report, integrate the impacts on growth, and more generally, there is a lack in mainstream economic modeling in incorporating that, and now that we see 2050 strategies coming out and being prepared, we're very concerned that actually the impact is not factoring, even impact on macroeconomic effect, given transformation, etc. So there is some way of doing it through the social carbon price, including some kind of calculation, but what would you see on that? The other question is on gas. So gas is the fast-growing fossil fuels in terms of generation, plant generation capacity, and it is the basically make or break it in terms of like net zero and energy-related CO2 emission. But I don't think we're doing a good job at highlighting that. And when it comes to power balances, we know that the gas industry is now organizing really hard to push back against 2050 strategies, and how do we get out of the trap of gas as low carbon resource when compared to 1.5 is not? So don't you think we need to have a much more clear communication about that? And if the new climate report says anything about gas infrastructure investment. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, that last one. I've been in so many communication workshops over the last sort of 5 to 10 years when, if the gas industry wants to fight coal, that's probably a good thing. But maybe we're at the end of that now.
Short term.
Yeah. Helen, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, briefly on both points, I think that the point on gas is really important. Most of the models and scenarios show gas plays a very important role in shifting to net zero. But it's a temporary role. It's a transitional fuel, and people talk about it as a bridge. And from the very start, we said, okay, if we're talking about gas as a bridge, what are the guardrails to make sure that bridge is safe, and where's the end of the bridge? And what's your mechanism to transition off? What's your off-ramp, right? And I think what we see is there's a risk that people seize on gas, and they go wholeheartedly to gas. They build in the infrastructure and the pipelines and the development for gas, and then there's no off-ramp, right? You're not doing that transition and making that a smooth process. And the guardrails are things like making sure that you actually capture methane instead of having leakage from gas, right? So what are the guardrails? Where's the end of the ramp? And we don't see enough discussion on that. I do think the other thing to bear in mind is that all of the projections we see, and apologies to colleagues this morning and all the colleagues I work with at the moment and in the past who do all of these projections, because it's hard work and it's excellent work, and all of us put in the absolute best information and knowledge and understanding we have to any of those models and projections, right? And the ones that Bill and others were highlighting this morning are fantastic. At the same thing, the one thing we know is that that's not going to be what the reality will be in 10 years or 15 or 20 years. These are projections, they're not predictions. And one of the things we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly around energy sector, is the best energy experts in the world completely underestimated how much renewables would come into the system. And we've seen the International Energy Agency has had pretty much every year to up its estimates of what renewable energy was possible. So one of the risks around gas is also that people say, well, this is how much gas we need in 2050. And the minute anyone says that, I think, really? Do you really know that? And will you think differently in 5 years' time and 10 years' time? So you need to not only build in the guardrails and the ramp off, you need to build in a ramp off that may come earlier, or a capacity which might be smaller than what you think you need today. So I think that is one of the critical things that we need to focus on.
And about the first point was about sort of climate impacts on growth.
Yeah, and so there are some models which are, and again, some of the results were highlighted this morning, on the impacts of climate change on the economy, on society, and some of the frightening results of that. Unfortunately, most of the economic models that are looking at the economy and projecting that forward, whether that's computable general equilibrium models or others, are very bad at reflecting those for various reasons. So what we tend to do is talk about both, right? We look at the economic growth, and as I said, I mean, we find just from an economic growth perspective, going low carbon and climate resilience than going with our business as usual trajectory. So we're already finding huge opportunities there. But then we also say, in addition to that, the business as usual path is wrong because we know there would be climate impacts, and some of the figures that we're starting to see from the insurance industry and others on what those impacts are. So right now the models, there are some attempts to actually try and bring these two together, but they tend to be separate exercises, and it needs a lot of work to really fully integrate them.
Thank you very much. Now, we're going to wrap up in a sec, but I just want to ask Michael for some sort of concluding thoughts. You've been with us all day, and right at the very beginning, you raised some interesting points about the IPCC report. Would it sort of make the case, a strong case, for limiting climate change? Is it achievable, not just from a technical point of view, from a social and governance point of view? And I suppose we've also had in the second panel, is it achievable in terms of the switch of finance point of view as well? So a few thoughts to leave us with, if you would.
Well, I think at the biggest level, I was just thinking, when Bill and I were first met he called me, it was about 30 years ago, a little more.
I was going to say that they had phones when you first met.
Yes, they did. He called me from Australia. He was working on the ozone depletion issue, and he wanted to talk. It's a connection that survived a lot in the meantime, and it's been great. And if we had thought about all the obstacles at that point, we would have done something else. And luckily we were young and stupid, and luckily we didn't think about all this. And so, and I think you're always in the same place. There's always tremendous obstacles. It's always the case that everything can be derailed because a lot of stuff goes on in the world that has nothing to do with climate change, and you have to learn to live in a shifting world and learn to kind of what are ways to deflect the bad stuff while looking for the opportunities, like the price of renewables surprisingly collapsing, and then let's use that. So, at any moment you have to be aware of what the possible is, and this finance stuff is very much in that spirit. Sure, it could be, steamrollered by something else, but, it's something that has to happen, and you just keep pushing on it. It's, who knows if we'll ever make 1.5 degrees? Who knows if we'll make 2 degrees? It doesn't matter. It's the effort. At this point, it's the effort that counts, because that'll make a big difference in the long run to where we actually do land. And just, my basic feeling is that it's going to be messy, that we're not going to wind up in some optimum solution that someone can draw a curve on, because it does involve this bigger social transformation, but that, human beings are very good at making terrible messes, as we have right now, but, that we're pretty clever about solving them. And so, my bottom line has always been, optimistic. I think we'll come out the other end of this with a world that's, actually, it might not be the first best world, but it'll be good enough.
Great, thank you very much. So thanks to all of our panelists today, Michael Oppenheimer, Jasmin Bell, Helen Mountford, also Tabea Lissner, Bill Hare, Jasmin, Cantzler, and thanks also to Ella Smith, who actually organised this whole thing. So we wouldn't have had that event without Bill, I think you've got a microphone in your hand. This looks ominous.
So I might have the pleasure of asking you a question for a change, Richard. But look, I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and particularly the last set of panelists, Helen, Justine, Michael, and Richard, for your help. As Michael said, we've been at this for a long time, and I think the first time that we discussed stratospheric ozone depletion issues and CFCs, we were not sure that we would actually secure a phase out of CFCs. That was by no means absolutely certain in 1985. The Vienna Convention failing to agree targets, and people were a bit depressed. But as Michael said, we got on and we did it. And I think that's the spirit now. We're seeing a lot of positive potential out there. We're seeing a lot of roadblocks, and some of the roadblocks are very big. But we've knocked over bigger roadblocks